Hi, last time we were talking about solving quadratic equations, and I mentioned that there were several ways of doing that. Some quadratic equations can be solved by factoring, where you get everything on one side equal to 0 on the other side, factor the side that isn't 0, and then set each factor equal to 0. So if you can see how to factor, that's often the easiest way. But that doesn't always work because not everything can be factored. Another way that we talked about last time is by taking square roots. Now that's handy if things are set up in the form something squared equals some number, but if things are not set up in that form, then you can't just right away solve by taking square roots. There is the method of completing the square, which I mentioned last time was kind of a bonus topic that you don't have to know about for this class, but that is one way of getting an equation into that form. But then there's the method that we're going to talk about today, and that is solving quadratic equations by using the famous quadratic formula. So here is how that works. A quadratic equation written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 has the solutions x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So this x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a is the famous quadratic formula. To use the formula, you have to get your quadratic equation in this form. That is, you have to get everything on one side arranged with the x squared term first, the x term in the middle, and the constant term on the end equal to 0 on the other side. Then the letters A, B, and C stand for whatever particular numbers happen to be involved in your equation. The A stands for the coefficient on x squared, the B stands for the coefficient on x, and the C stands for the constant term. So if you plug those three numbers into this formula and do what the formula tells you to do, it will give you usually two different solutions. One when you take the plus here, when you add, and the other one when you do the minus, when you subtract. So we are going to be working through some examples, so hopefully you'll see how this works. But before we do, a few warnings or things to watch out for. These are some common mistakes that I see people make when they're trying to use the quadratic formula. First, put numbers only in place of the A, B, and C. You should not be putting any x's into the formula. The A, B, and C don't stand for the x's, they just stand for the numbers in front of the x squared and the x, and then the constant term. In this part of the formula where you have b squared, make sure that always comes out positive. Even if b is a negative number squared should be positive. Sometimes A or C is a negative number, and if that happens, then you're going to be subtracting a negative, which is the same as adding a positive. And notice that the entire thing, the negative b and the part under the square root sign, is all over 2a. So you're dividing this whole thing, both the negative b part and the square root of b squared minus 4ac part, by 2a. So you can't just divide one part or the other by 2a. It all has to be divided by 2a. So with that in mind, let's work through some examples and see this formula in action. Let's use it to solve the equation 3x squared plus 10x equals 8. And by the way, this is an example of an equation that could be solved by factoring, but it can also be solved by the quadratic formula. So let's do it that way. First thing to do is to get everything on one side equal to 0 on the other side. Right now there isn't a 0 on one side, there's an 8. So we would subtract 8 on both sides. Now we're ready to start putting numbers into the formula. So the numbers we're going to be putting in for A, B, and C are the 3 and the 10 and the -8. So here we go. We're putting 3 in place of A. So the two places in the formula where there was a letter A, we're putting in the number 3. B, the part of B is being played by 10. So the two places in the formula where there was a B, we're putting in the number 10. And C is -8. Not just 8, but -8, because the minus sign in front of it is part of that number. So that one place in the formula where there's a letter C, we put in the number -8. And now we're ready to start simplifying this down. So here we have a -10. Here we have 10 squared, which would be 100. 4 times 3 would be 12, times -8 would be -96. And this is one of those things I was warning you about. C is a negative number. So here we end up subtracting a negative. This is minus -96, which would be the same thing as if we were adding positive 96. So when we go ahead and do 100 minus negative or plus positive 96, we get the number 196 under the square root sign. Now 196 is a perfect square. If you ask your calculator what the square root of 196 is, it'll tell you that it's just 14. So where it says the square root of 196, we can just say 14. So now we're looking at x equals -10 plus or minus 14 all over 6. So we do get two different solutions, one when we do the plus and the other one when we do the minus. This means that x can either equal -10 plus 14 over 6, or it can equal -10 minus 14 over 6. So in the first case, -10 plus 14 would be 4. So that would be 4 over 6. In the second case, -10 minus 14 would be -24. So that's -24 over 6. And those can both be simplified. 4 over 6 in lowest terms is 2/3. And -24 over 6 is -4. So those are the two solutions to that equation. X can equal 2/3 or -4. Let's try another example. X squared minus 10x plus 19 equals 0. So this is already set up the way we want it, with everything on one side equal to 0 on the other side. So we're ready to start plugging numbers into the formula. What number are we going to put in for A? Well, it doesn't look like there is a number in front of the x squared, so that means that the coefficient on x squared is 1. What number are we going to be putting in for B? -10. What number are we going to be putting in for C? 19. So when we put these numbers into the formula, we get x equals minus -10 plus or minus the square root of -10 squared minus 4 times 1 times 19 all over 2 times 1. Now minus -10 is just positive 10. There's a minus in front of the b in the formula, but b itself is a negative number this time around. So the opposite or negative of a negative is a positive. And this is another thing I was warning you about. B is a negative number, but when we square that, we should get a positive number. Negative 10 times itself is 100. And then 4 times 1 is 4, times 19 is 76. So under the radical sign, we have 100 minus 76. And on the bottom, 2 times 1 would just be 2. Now let's finish simplifying under the radical sign. If we go ahead and subtract 100 minus 76, we get 24. Now 24 is not a perfect square. The square root of 24 is not a nice whole number, but we can simplify this. We can break 24 up into 4 times 6, and then the square root of 4 would be 2, and the square root of 6 would just be the square root of 6. So we talked about that back in chapter 10, how to simplify something like this. So this simplifies to 2 times the square root of 6. And now this is all over 2, 10 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 6, all over 2. That means the 10 has to get divided by 2, and the 2 times the square root of 6 has to get divided by 2. So 10 divided by 2 is 5. 2 times the square root of 6 divided by 2 would just be the square root of 6. And here's our final solutions. One of them is 5 plus the square root of 6, and the other one is 5 minus the square root of 6. And if you watched my bonus video about completing the square, maybe you remember that this was one of the examples that I did that way. So if you watched my bonus video, you saw me solve this equation by the completing the square method, and this is what we got for our solutions. 5 plus or minus the square root of 6. Okay, let's try another one. X squared minus 2x plus 5 equals 0. So this is set up the way we want it. Everything on one side equal to 0 on the other side. We're ready to plug numbers into the formula. What number are we putting in for A? 1. What number are we putting in for B? Negative 2. What number are we putting in for C? 5. So when we actually put those numbers in, here's what it looks like. Minus negative 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times 5 all over 2 times 1. So negative 2 would just be a positive 2. Negative 2 squared would be a positive 4. 4 times 1 is 4 times 5 is 20. So under the radical sign, we have a 4 minus a 20. And down here, 2 times 1 is 2. To finish up under the radical sign, 4 minus 20 would be negative 16. So we have 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 16 all over 2. Now, do you remember, this would have been section 10.7, what we do when we have the square root of a negative number? That's where I gets involved. If this were the square root of positive 16, that would just be 4. But the square root of negative 16 would be 4i. So we have x equals 2 plus or minus 4i all over 2. And both of those get divided by 2. The 2 divided by 2 is 1, plus or minus the 4i divided by 2 is 2i. So we did get two solutions. They were complex numbers. One of them was 1 plus 2i, and the other one was 1 minus 2i. And I'm going to end this video here and come back in part 2 and work through a couple more examples to make sure we've got the hang of this, and also talk a little more about this part under the square root sign and what it means when it comes out negative or positive or maybe just 0.